What's up everyone, Nathan Larsen here with another video for you home studio musicians, artists, songwriters, and producers. In this video I'm going to show you how to make one string player sound like a string orchestra. Check it. I just gotta say guys, I'm so excited. This is gonna be good. Okay, so there's a lot to cover in this video, but I first wanna say thank you to today's sponsor, DistroKid. If you want your music on Spotify, Apple Music, and all the major streaming platforms, you need a music distributor. DistroKid keeps it super simple by making it as easy as an annual fee, and you can upload as much music as you want. So if you're even putting up a few songs per year, it's a sweet deal. If you're consistently making new songs, it's a great deal, but what's even better is they're giving you guys a discounted first year by using the link I've got in the description down below. Back to the video. All right, so in order to get one string player to sound like what I showed you, you obviously need to start with having access to a string player. If there's enough interest, I can make an entire video about writing for strings from a compositional and arranging perspective, but for this video, I really wanted to focus on the production side. You really need to make sure that whoever you're gonna have come in is a good player. Stringed instruments like violin, viola, and cello are not like guitar and bass. One of the biggest differences is they have no frets, so tuning is a lot more difficult than just making sure the instrument is in tune like with a guitar. So with that in mind, make sure you're working with a player who can play in tune, because there's almost nothing worse than having a player who has terrible intonation. The next thing you need to be aware of is that stringed instruments are really noisy. There's a lot of noise that you're gonna be capturing that you need to be aware of, like the bow noise and other artifacts you're gonna hear. So make sure you're listening for those things as you track throughout the session. Okay, so in order to get this rich and full sound, we need to basically layer in the strings many times over. For this recording, I had a total of 5 different parts, 3 violins and 2 violas. If you want this to sound like an ensemble, then make sure you have multiple parts to give you that rich sound. Having just one part is fine, but it's not gonna sound the same as if you're building a lot of harmonic structures or basically building chords with the strings. My string player not only plays violin, but she also plays viola, so I definitely took advantage of that and I wrote out 2 viola parts for her as well, as I mentioned. So in total, 3 violin parts and 2 viola parts. My process for getting everything ready is to first start with MIDI strings and write out all the parts within my DAW. This is gonna give me a really good idea of how this is all gonna sound once I get my real player in. And I don't skimp out on the dynamic control with the MIDI instruments. I try to program the strings to sound as good as possible, even for the demo purposes. But as you're gonna see here in a bit, I do layer in the MIDI strings with the real player to add more depth. From there, I'm gonna notate the music in finale for my player. And if you've never worked with a string player before, you need to understand that most string players cannot improvise unless you're working with a professional session player or a player who actually has a background in improvisation. So you can't just tell a player, just do something like this. They're gonna look at you cross-eyed. Side note, if you are writing for viola, you do need to know that violists read music in the alto clef, not the treble clef. Okay, so after I have everything notated out, I'm basically gonna get ready for tracking. To get the session ready, I created 4 tracks per part in advance with just a high-pass filter to cut anything below about 100 Hertz. And for the actual session, you're gonna need to track each part at the very minimum 3 times over in order to get a bit more of that rich sound. It's ultimately gonna come down to what you want this to sound like, but if you only track the part over twice, you're gonna get some really conflicting sounds. It's not gonna have a lot of richness, and it's not gonna sound as good. Just listen to what it sounds like if I only have 2 violins playing together. But as you add that 3rd layer, it begins to add a little more richness like this. And for this project, I layered in a total of 4 times to sound like this. For now, what you just heard has no reverb on it. That's just a dry signal. I'm gonna show you how to add more flavor here in a minute. I made it so my player could also hear the MIDI strings really well in her headphones while she did the tracking. That's gonna help her play in tune a lot better. I would also recommend your string player have one ear of the headphones off so they can hear themselves for tuning and intonation purposes. As far as miking position, I placed my microphone basically right above the body of the instrument, as you can see. You can also place the microphone right in front of the player too. Now I didn't do this in this session, though if I could do it over, I certainly would, but you can also change the mic position for each take to reduce the chances of having phasing problems. This is also going to change the tonal character of the instrument, so as you layer things in, it's going to add a little bit more richness and depth. From here, it's really kind of a tedious process of just doing layer after layer. Again, I had 5 parts. though not every part is playing all the time. So we had a total of 20 tracks for each layer, and that's not including what I'm about to talk about, which is the riser effect. I do want to say a huge thank you for sticking with me this long. This is a ton of information. I really hope it's been valuable to you. It'd mean a lot if you'd consider subscribing and clicking the bell to get notified when new videos come out. And you better believe that I've got some great ideas for future videos. Let me show you this riser effect I mentioned. Listen to this section where I've got this electronic riser happening right before a chorus. I had the idea of including a more cinematic effect by having Mary play tons of layers of glissandos, which is basically just sliding up the neck of the instrument. So I thought it'd be epic to add something like that in here. So after working out a few different options, we landed on doing 3 separate parts, one a bit lower, one an octave higher, and then one a fifth above the lowest one. And then I had her play that glissando up an octave for each take. We layered this in a bunch of times, as you can see from the tracks I have here. Now listen to how this sounds soloed out. Yeah, it's super epic, and once you add in the electronic riser and everything else, we wind up with this. Boom! Okay, so here is just a quick run through in the DAW of what each part sounds like on its own, and then I'll add each part so you can hear how much of a difference it makes as we add more parts. I'm going to include the main keyboard part for context here. So all of this is to show that by adding more parts in the part writing, it gives a more dense and full sound. So if you really want that ensemble sound, then writing at least 3-part harmony is going to really help you do that. In the last chorus, however, I did something a bit different by having the violas play the staccato part and the violins play a lead line in the octaves. Check this out. So whenever I've got big lead melodies like this, I love using octaves to really add some beef to the idea, and it sounds great. It gives a really cinematic vibe, since if this was for a real string orchestra or a film score, using that octave technique for main parts is super common. What I did after everything was tracked was edit absolutely everything. I made sure all the rhythms were accurate, and I corrected any major tuning problems. Let me just say that editing is 100% essential if you want a professional sound in the end. If you do not edit, you really can't be wondering why your stuff is not sounding amazing. So please don't be lazy and make sure you edit. And to be clear, Mary did an amazing job in this session. She's a great player. Editing is not about fixing a crap performance, it's about polishing what's already good. Now, once everything is edited, I still have a ton of tracks to look at, so to just keep things more clean, I bounced down each part into one track so I could add plugins and mix to each section rather than every single instrument. However, I did not delete the individual tracks, I just turned them off, hit them so that if I ever need to go back, I can. Now that I have just one track for each part, I can start adding in more flavor. Since I'm not in the post-production stage yet, I'm not terribly worried about mixing, but I do some mixing as I go to make everything sound great. So I created 2 buses for reverbs. One has a short reverb and one has a large reverb. Another side note, I'm making an entire video on how I made this whole song in a few weeks because absolutely everything I'm doing in the song is only using built-in Logic Pro plugins and MIDI instruments. So nothing you hear as far as plugins and MIDI is paid to show you that you can still make great music using stock plugins and instruments. So for the reverbs, I am using stock reverbs built into Logic, which are still really good. I have the short reverb to add presence and fullness, and then I use that long reverb as more of a hall to make it sound like it's fitting into the sonic space that I want. Now, in the beginning of the song, I really wanted to have this muted string sound, but the strings sound very bright because stringed instruments are very naturally bright. So what I did was created 5 new tracks and cut the beginning parts out, move them to the separate tracks so I could create an entirely different sound without having to use automation. You could definitely use automation to do this without creating more tracks, but I wanted more reverb and I wanted to treat these as their own entirely. So now that I've done that, here's what the beginning sounds like after I rolled off a lot of that top end and added more reverb. This is ultimately going to make space for the vocal, which is a female singer I have coming in later. So I didn't want my strings competing with the vocal right away in verse 1. I want that vocal to sit right on top. You can stick around for the full video on this later in a couple weeks to hear what this is going to sound like with vocals. Okay, so now we're just about done. The last thing that needs to happen is to layer in the MIDI strings for more depth. The strings that I tracked sound great, but they're really bright and they don't have that same level of depth that I want. However, the MIDI strings do have a good amount of depth, but where the MIDI strings fall flat is in the dynamic and overall realism. So the live strings are going to make up for that, whereas the MIDI strings are going to make up for the missing depth. So I add in the MIDI strings, mix those in with the live strings for additional richness, and once I get to post-production, I will certainly spend more time on really making sure this is working well together. But here's what this sounds like with the samples and then once without. Finally, I wanted to say that if you are a home studio artist who's really wanting to dramatically improve your home studio productions, you should check out my website, nathanjlarsen.com. I have a link below. I do work with a small number of musicians in more of a one-on-one capacity to really help you target what you need help with specifically. If that sounds like something for you, then go apply on my website. Thanks so much for watching. I really do hope you got a lot out of this video. Make sure you subscribe for more free content, drop a comment, give it a like. See you soon.